Welcome to our latest webinar, a 50-year journey without a destination. My name is Michelle Matthews with Digital Transitions, and our special guest tonight is Robert Sinclair from Dallas, Texas. For about 50 years, Robert has been enjoying photographing people and landscapes. His primary goal is to just enjoy the process of creating a visual image. Often he comes up with a single idea, and from there he ends up coming up with a larger body of work from that. His work can be seen in private collections as well as offices throughout the United States. So today, staff-wise, we have Doug Peterson, head of R&D, and Karsten from marketing, and myself. And then we're going to be moderating the chat. So down to the right, you can see you can put your questions in there for the Q&A, which will be at the end. And we'll pull up the questions and answer them one at a time at the end. And then I'll tell you a little bit about Digital Transitions, and then we'll get started. So Digital Transitions, we have 4 different divisions at Digital Transitions. We have the commercial photo division. Then we have our culture and heritage division, which is specializing in digitization, equipment with galleries, libraries, museums, and archives. And then one of our newer additions is Pixel Acuity, and Pixel Acuity is a service bureau that digitizes and preserves archival materials for different museums as well as private individuals as well. Then we have our scientific division is our 4th division. I'm honored to present Robert Sinclair, and he will be speaking on his journey in photography that has spanned over the last 5 decades. So Robert, take it away.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who's here on this talk. I hope it's of interest to you. Thankfully for all of us, I'm not going to take us through 50 years of photographing, but what I do want to do is provide some perspectives I came to realize over that relatively extensive period of time on how I've thought about making pictures and what about that has changed, and how the equipment I've used along the way has influenced my work. I enjoy making images using cameras and also by drawing. And I have the boxes of slides, negatives, and terabytes of external drives, all accumulated over a few decades to show for it. But much of that time, I'm not sure I had any particular destination for any of it. It's not as though it didn't have some sort of purpose. It's just that the objectives varied pretty widely. I never considered pursuing a career in photography, but I've known for as long as I can recall that I wanted to make photography a part of my life and lifestyle. Once I started, it never occurred to me to not have it in my life. And when it wasn't there, I knew I missed it. There's no doubt that for me, it's about something that stimulates my need to make an image, and then the reward of seeing how well it succeeds in meeting whatever that initial something was. Somehow, all of this evolved to where today, I do think about why I'm making an image and then try to achieve the best result I can get. We're going to skip the first 30 years or so because I call those the reactive as opposed to proactive years. I had 35 millimeter film and then digital cameras in hand much of the time, and using them was, for the most part, a reaction to whatever I was doing or seeing. The images were about people, places, things, or activities I encountered or pursued along the way. This is not unlike all of us today with the camera in our phone, except that before the 90s or 2000s, to do this required carrying around an actual camera loaded with film. Those boxes of slides and negatives and all those terabytes suggest I had a camera with me a fair amount. But it's interesting to me that in preparing for this talk, I went through some of those boxes, and other than the memories, I really couldn't find much worth looking at. I'm not sure why I stuck with it, but I'm glad that I have. If there was a proactive part in the first few decades, it was the darkroom or the printmaking of actually making the image. The printmaking was and is a significant part of my photographic ethos. I shoot for the print and always have. I suppose it's because I built a darkroom in the attic of our family home not long after I purchased my first SLR when I was 14 or 15. And I probably learned more about photography and image making from working in the wet and digital darkrooms than I have from behind the camera. Carson, there we go. While I promised to spare us from the first 30 years, this image from 50 years ago is included as a reference point or trailhead marker just to get us started. This is one of the first photographs I made when I purchased that first SLR, and in fact, it would not surprise me if it was in the first roll. As I think about it in the context of this talk, in some way, that purchase might reflect the first time I made a decision to become serious about photography, because it meant I was upgrading from a Kodak Instamatic, and I consciously thought I wanted to or needed to use better equipment to help me make better images. If there is an overarching message in this talk, it's that the best camera to have on you is the one that can best achieve the results you desire. In some cases, that's not just any camera or the one you have on you, to repeat the famous quote. It requires the best camera for the purpose. This student level picture remains one of my favorites because for me, it marks the beginning of my active pursuits in photography that continue even more strongly or enthusiastically today. And then to provide some perspective or a mile marker further along in this journey, this image was made in 2019, almost 50 years later, using the 150 megapixel Phase 1 IQ4 150, an Arca Swiss Factum camera, and a Rodenstock 40 millimeter lens. We're going to come back to this picture in a few minutes in the context of the value of medium format equipment and output, but I wanted to put it up to compare with the old 35 millimeter, because despite the many differences, they both reflect some similarities in terms of how I see things, but mostly they serve as reminders as to my continuing desire to purposefully and hopefully thoughtfully make photographic images. Starting about 20 years ago, I began to consider that I wanted to be more thoughtful about making pictures. This idea was prompted by having spent a sabbatical year of sorts, living in Italy, and enrolled in a part-time figurative life drawing class and reading a lot of art history books. That year in Italy had significant impact on rekindling my creative interests after 25 years of being in business and growing a family. While photography was always a part of those and my life, its purpose was more about recording than creating. I was taking pictures rather than making images. And as mentioned before, a few of those had any enduring qualities. So upon my return to the US, I established a studio apart from my home and was both drawing and photographing in earnest. Much of my work at that time was a continuation of my figure drawing in Italy, and I learned that figure photography complemented that. At the same time, I started to view outdoor or landscape work more as an actual subject rather than simply making images of places. Because we sold our house to move to Italy, upon our return, for the first time in over a decade, I didn't have a wet darkroom at easy disposal. And while digital printing was improving, because DSLRs were still in the single-digit megapixel range, I thought that to get the better print, I needed to step up to larger format equipment and could then scan the larger negatives for digital printing. I purchased a 4x5 field camera and worked to teach myself how to use it. But this was a frustrating period in the journey, and I never made a 4x5 film image I would consider worth looking at a second time. Stumbling along while upgrading 35 millimeter digitals as they came out with the hope they could achieve higher levels of digital print quality. In 2008, I learned about Phase 1 and its 40 megapixel P45 plus medium format digital back. So I purchased one with the 645 body and a Linhof view camera. This image made in 2009 with the P45 plus revealed to me what some of the value beyond print size and print quality that digital medium format was. I could see into the deep darkness of the storm while still retaining all of the detail and tonal qualities in the highlighted clouds. So let's run through a selection of photographs made since 2009 using a series of phase backs from the 40, 60, 80, 100, and then 150 megapixel sensors. This current image is in the Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean. My boat guide, who was also a photographer, and I watched the movement of the clouds to chase where the sun hit the water when breaking through. This one, made with the P65 Plus on the Linhof, took 3 days of trying to get because I needed the right light for a slow shutter speed for the silky water because I didn't have the right filters. But it was also about getting everything in the image in focus using the field camera. I travel to Scotland about every year and do lots of walking with the camera in the backpack. For this picture of the barley field, I used the 80 megapixel IQ 180. I had this back for probably 5 years on different bodies or cameras, with this one being on a phase 645, and I used bracketing to shoot into the sunlight. And using the same back on the Linhof, I spent a number of years trying to get an image of shiprock in northwestern New Mexico that I would be satisfied with. This one came about by watching the weather, getting up at 3 a.m. and driving several hours on New Year's Day in 2013 when it was about 10 degrees after a snowstorm had passed through the night before. It was so cold, the air was sparkling in the early morning light because of the frozen moisture in it. This frozen air created an atmosphere one could touch, and a polarizer filter helped provide some nice contrast. And then these next two are on the IQ 180 on the Mamiya RZ67 Pro 2D. At some point, I started purposefully looking to find trees as a primary subject, and this continues even now. And I like the slow and manual process of shooting with this camera that accommodates both film and digital backs. And for those that haven't seen one in a while, this is the camera. And right now it has a film back on it, but I can also put a phase digital back on the back of it. We now jump to the 100 megapixel IQ 100 achromatic I used to capture this serene place in Scotland. And then finally, the 150 megapixel IQ 150 achromatic, which I used to make this image this spring during the lockdown when I had plenty of time just to practice and explore the qualities of the tonal range this back produces. And I have no doubt, I think I was channeling the new normal of social distancing when composing this image. We're going to come back to the achromatic backs in a minute. To me, what all of these images have in common is that over the last dozen or more years, my approach to making photographs was and is evolving into a process of making imagery that had some measure of forethought. This started coming about for several reasons, including because I wanted to alter my approach in such a way, but also because the medium format gear is bigger and in most cases heavier. So there's a physical commitment to it, and one would probably want to think about what they're doing in advance, especially if carrying the photo gear around in a backpack. It was also because the resulting images have more information and therefore detail than 35 millimeter. So it's imperative to be more thoughtful about the overall process to get the picture right. The flaws will show up more readily if you don't. I find this slows down the image making in beneficial ways. And I think there's probably this element that because the equipment is more expensive and thus a further commitment, there is this inherent respect that seems to impact the overall approach. I can't measure that, but it seems like I handle the gear a whole lot more thoughtfully. Regardless of the reasons, there's no doubt that the decision to work with the first medium format digital back in 2008 had significant influence on my work and the approach going forward. Wrongly, however, with the IQ 180 I bought several years ago, I thought my photo kit was complete. But in 2018, Phase announced the 150 megapixel IQ. Because I had skipped the upgrade to the IQ 100 when it first came out, the IQ 4 was nearly a doubling of the image size that I had. What I didn't realize was that the 150 megapixels was about much more than the significantly larger print size. It was about the incredible amount of quality visual information within the image. As a result of this evolution or progression to a more thoughtful approach, I came to realize that the approach had become more proactive and even evolved into a project or idea-driven work, from the reactive taking pictures of people, places, things, that was more to record than create. I'd wanted to be more thoughtful about making images, and I began to feel like that was happening. And I guess at some level, I'm crediting the equipment with assisting me in that. To provide some examples of this, let's touch on a couple I've worked on in recent years. Thales of Miletus was considered to be the earliest of the Greek philosophers, and it was intriguing to me that his philosophy was that all things come from and can return to being water. I wanted to explore how to reflect that idea in photographs. I decided upon triptychs printed as a single image as the way to reflect the various elements or phases, and the bands separating them is what Thales couldn't quite explain, how the metamorphosis between the phases actually occurs. Of course, this did not require medium format cameras, and while some of the images were made with medium format, like this one, some were not. But it was the process of thinking about an idea in advance and then how best to reflect it that sort of got me thinking about the relationship between executing on the idea and the equipment that would best accomplish that. I've had the good fortune of spending time in the desert Southwest, predominantly in eastern Utah and western Colorado. I'd been in this environment in the fall, spring, and summer, but never the winter. I had this expectation about the dichotomy between a place we consider hot, yet in the winter it's cold. I was watching a series of snowstorms that were consistently passing through in early January a few years ago. So I ventured into the Canyonlands and Arches National Parks for a few days to see what the snow in the desert would feel like and was it worth capturing. The conditions exceeded my expectations. However, while I had medium format gear with me, I didn't have the wider lenses I needed to capture what or how I wanted to. So I used my 35 millimeter equipment instead. And while I like the nature of these images, I hope to return to explore the desert in winter conditions with medium format gear. I say this because it's worth pointing out that one of the biggest differences I found between the formats can be seen in these pictures. In the smaller sensor, the darks and shadow areas are compressed and do not reveal the same tonal range as one would get from a larger format sensor. And there is an inherent difference in the sharpness that the rocks and details could be better revealed with using the highest quality medium format glass that's offered. Medium format would simply give me more information to work with to capture the qualities of the rocks and the subtleties of the clouds, the fog, and the snow. I found the quality of the lenses and the greater information allow me to create images one can wander around in. The last project I'm going to touch on before we go into my most recent is Permian. My home state of Texas is the largest oil and wind power producing state in the U.S. The spring of 2019 was notable because the U.S. achieved the highest level of oil production ever, and most of that came from the Permian Basin in West Texas. I wanted to explore how this could be captured, while at the same time capturing the wind power generators where the two energy resources are commingled. There's a transition in energy sources on the horizon for sure, and it seemed to me that this particular moment in time was worth exploring. Of course, I could have made these with my 35 millimeter equipment, but this image, for example, made with the IQ4 150 on the XF, needs to be big so as to reflect the magnitude or impact of the dust storm and to see the details in the rigs in the distance, and those require the larger format gear. I want the viewer of the print to be in the dust storm, and the print needs to be big enough to help accomplish that. I suppose at some level, or certainly superficially, these ideas have nothing in common, but from somewhere inside, I felt the need to express or represent them in the form of photographs. But can't any camera capture the nature of the images or the ideas? Or why would the equipment influence the nature of the work? Well, I'm not going to credit the gear with the ideas, but I will give the gear the credit for helping me consider how best to execute the captures to depict the ideas. Is medium format always the best? I'm going to say no. If I want to capture a photograph of a flying eagle, I'm going to want something that has extra long focal length lenses and really fast frame rates. And if I want to capture my grandchildren who never stop moving, at least when they're awake, with some predetermined exposure settings and a pre-focused manual wide-angle lens, my 35mm rangefinder is the fastest point and shoot I have. But even with the varying nature of my work, the answer is yes. Medium format is generally the best equipment for the most of what I do and capture, which seems to frequently include trees, clouds, rocks, or water. And I can capture the image with all of the information in the file I need to get what I want for the kind of output I want, the print. So let's look back at the image I put up at the outset, made in 2019, which happens to include trees, clouds, rocks, and water, and how the light influences each of these. Cropping to 100% on this fisherman reveals a level of detail that includes the feather in his hat and the fly line on his rod. And equally important, the shadows in this backlit image fully reveal all of the details of the trees and the mountainside behind him, while at the same time, the details in the highlighted cloud at the top of the mountain. In addition, everything from the rocks at the bottom of my feet to that mountaintop are in sharp focus as a result of the quality of the lens, the movements of the camera, and the resolution of the 150 megapixel back. This is an image one can enter and then wander around in because all of the details are sharp, and the shadows and the highlights actually reveal content. When I first received and shot the IQ4-150 in late 2018, I was amazed by the significant difference between it and the IQ180 I had used for 5 years. It was immediately apparent to me that the sharpness of the images required flawless image construction, but at the same time, the dynamic range would allow for capturing some challenging exposure setups. For me, this back was a game changer in terms of how and what I could think about capturing. And so once again, I thought I was done, had found the perfect gear setup for the things I enjoy thinking about capturing. But I did run into this issue that the IQ4 and that Mamiya RZ67 I just showed a minute ago that I enjoy shooting so much, they were incompatible. I wanted to keep using this camera with both digital and film captures because while it's big to the point of being cumbersome at times, there is a pleasure in its bellows focusing and the seismic event-like shutter release. So I purchased a pre-owned IQ3-100 achromatic to use on it. I'd resisted the achromatic when it first came out a few years before because I was afraid of being caught in a circumstance of needing color. And all we need to do today to turn an image into black and white is with the click of a button in our software. For those unfamiliar with the achromatic, I won't slow us down and go into the details here, but in short, the Phase 1 achromatic backs only shoot or produce a monochrome or black and white image. There is no color information in the file. Beautifully, the sensor is only capturing the luminosity or intensity of the light. Because it would also work in my Arca Swiss cameras, I would have both color and true black and white or pure grays at my disposal. Well, the first images I made with the Acro on the Arcas with Rodenstocks were stunning, both in their sharpness and tonal range. These were simply higher quality monochromes than any converted color image I'd ever done. And there was this pleasure in having to think about on-camera filtering as with black and white film, because there isn't any color information in the file. So when Phase 1 announced the XT in 2019, and I determined it would fit my needs because it helped me extend or expand the lenses in the direction I needed, which was wider, and because for an upcoming project into the Arctic, it would be a more efficient tool than what I had, I purchased the IQ4-150 achromatic in the XT package. So now the decisions to upgrade to the IQ4-150 and then add the IQ4 achromatic were once again about equipment that would heavily influence my work, and given what I'd spent, hopefully in positive ways. This image and the next reflect the decision-making I now have regarding color and monochrome. This first one is yelling to be shot in color. It's what caused me to notice the opportunity to begin with. But at the same location on a different day, color wasn't the subject my eye saw. It was the movement of the clouds against the structure of the trees and all in the reflection versus the actual objects. The colors didn't matter. It was the shapes and design. So why include the colors, as they would just be a distraction? And from what I've now seen, turning a color image into a monochrome is not the same as capturing it in monochrome. There is a difference in the quality of that black and white. So given what I have seen in the way of quality from the acro for a monochrome image, I do not see ever converting another color image into black and white. The equipment has definitely led me on this one, and it's funny to me that it's no different than the same decision I made over countless times over the 50 years with film. What do I load the camera with, color or black and white? And just to provide some additional perspectives on the capabilities to consider, this and the last image were made with the IQ4 150 acro on the XT with a 32mm lens. In the last image, using auto frame averaging, I was able to eliminate the snowflakes coming down on me. And in this case, I manually focus stacked to get the rocks and the trees in sharp focus, and each of the 5 or 6 exposures were made also using auto frame averaging for 2 minutes each to create the silky water effect. With the optionality to choose between the color and monochrome backs, I've learned that unless color is the subject or the first thing I saw or grabbed my attention, I tend to see the design and structure first, and in most cases have found that makes the decision for me.
That's good. Just like some.
In mid-February of this year, I traveled to Svalbard, northernmost Norway. It's located about 700 miles from the North Pole to photograph the transition of light coming out of a dark polar winter in January to the beginnings of the sunlit sunny winter in early to mid-March. I learned about Svalbard and its light a couple of years ago following a nearly 2-week photo journey to the Faroe Islands, which at that time I thought was on the edge of the earth. I was wrong. The image I was making in the video is the one we just saw, and this is a crop of 100% crop to reflect the level of detail. And I shot this using the XT with the 32mm lens and the achromatic back. For comparative purposes, the Faroes project was about photographing the actual land or landscape, and I was wanting to use stitched panoramas, if possible, to best capture the otherworldly shapes and dramatic cliffs I'd seen in photographs. I chose February because it offered low in the sky sun on days when it wasn't raining or snowing, so I could have shadows and contrast even midday. And the hostile winter weather environment typically extends into February and could provide some drama too. Substantially all of my images in the Faroes were made using the medium format 50 megapixel Hasselblad X1D, which I decided to use because of the predominantly inclement weather in this place. Svalbard, on the other hand, was for me about the light and not the landscape. And my research led me to the transitional period from mid-February to mid-March as the time to capture the blue light I had learned about and the transition into the sunny winter. For most photographers and tourists going to Svalbard, summer is the most active season, but as the waters around the islands begin to freeze and it gets dark from November to February, the most common photographic interests are the northern lights or aurora borealis. While there, I did capture the aurora in both color and monochrome, And I can tell you, it can be an interesting experience to go out at night when it's minus 20 or minus 30 and sit on the ground. And I was also able to capture Arctic foxes and reindeer because they're everywhere. And in some cases, they provide some nice content with the light. But my interest did not include aurora, reindeer, foxes, or even polar bears. So our outings were not the norm. And my intrepid guide, Chico Matos, and I were free to roam or just explore. What I did not expect was the nature of the light I experienced and how the atmosphere creates the unique qualities one can see. I took this with my iPhone from the airplane when I was arriving on February the 17th. This was about 2 in the afternoon and looking to the west. The sun is out of view to our left and thus in the south and below the horizon. And we're headed into the darkness to the north. For presenting here, I slightly oversaturated this picture so we can see the spectrum of colors, the importance of which I would only learn to fully appreciate months later when trying to print the images. It has taken this non-scientist some time to understand what is going on, and I'm not going to try to explain what I don't fully understand. But as I gather, because it is so cold in the Arctic and the moisture in the atmosphere can be frozen, creating infinite ice crystals, the light that passes through these crystals gets refracted and reflected, and this bending of sorts effectively causes the light to arc across and through the atmosphere, and what we see is the sky. And the location of the sun being in the south is important in this recipe because it limits the exposure, so to speak. As a result, at times, we saw a wonderful array of colors with our eyes, but the IQ4 saw so much more of the spectrum, which is better revealed in the print of this image rather than this small screen version. The print reveals the sky was a soft rainbow of colors. I should mention that the reason this image looks so soft is not because it's out of focus, but because we're in frozen fog at the ground level. I had to make this using the XT and IQ4 at ISO 800 to get a fast enough shutter speed to hand hold it, because at minus 40, my tripod head, which had lost its cover, had frozen, and the sun was well below the horizon, so it was getting dark. I'm still very much in the throes of selecting final images and working on them, so I'll only talk about a couple more. But these in particular best reflect how the equipment served my purposes or objectives. What's interesting to me is that because the camera sees so much more than we do, it offers me many more potential outputs than what I recall seeing at the time. But that means I have the opportunity to reproduce what I saw and felt and give that to the viewer. The hardware and software are not restricting me to what they are or limited to or by. In this one, once back at home and in the digital darkroom, it took looking at the shot data to understand that it was relatively dark when I made it. The snow fools one into thinking it's brighter, and this was the case many times. In this particular case, which is a 4-shot panorama using the XT and 32mm lens, each image was shot at ISO 400 for over a second at f11. And if we were to zoom in on some areas in the sky, you can see stars. The shot data and the stars tell me it was relatively dark, and thankfully the camera captured everything so that I could process the images accordingly. What I was drawn to capture was the contrast between the dark sky in the background with the diffused, refracted, and reflected light just peeking over the horizon. And this combination caused the snow on the mountains to glow. This caused me to make the pano because I wanted to get all of those ingredients. I've been in the mountains all my life, and I'd never seen anything like this before. It was like being inside a global light, where light's coming from all directions, and thus the shadows and the contrast are muted. But there are these highlighted areas that seem to reflect and give the sense of this glow. It is this gradient in the sky contrasted against the glowing snow that is more important to me than the landscape or objects on the ground. I found in looking through my images that many times I was composing on the light in the sky, more so than the landscape. This image was made a couple of hours later in the same area, but looking to the east. Note the sun is to the south, And I know, excuse me, and I know there was a small portion of it just at the horizon and the rest of it below. This is at noon. One can also see the gradient of the light and the colors in the sky. This image was made with dusk light in the clouds behind me to the left and a half moon up to my right. For reference, Carson, I think we got one more. Yeah, there we go. For reference, this one is the 180-degree viewpoint. The glacier in the last image is now behind me, and this provides some reference to the light and the amazing location. Just for scale, those mountains and the cliffs you see on the right in the distance near the center of the image are about 8 miles from the camera, and we're standing on the frozen sea or water in the fjord. Tour boats would be traveling into here in just a few months after it melts, but my guide Chico and I were alone in this remote place. For reference on how dark it was, the ISO was 400, the aperture f11, and the shutter was a relatively long exposure of 25 seconds. It was after 7 o'clock at night, and the sun's brief appearance just over the horizon that day was long gone. We were standing on the frozen sea at the end of this fjord called Templefjorden, near the toe or terminus of Tunabreen Glacier. I thought I'd captured some interesting images of the glacier as it was getting darker and darker. But as we were just enjoying the thankfully windless and thus quiet moonlit night, I noticed that as it got darker, the glacier appeared to glow by the moonlight, so I made this one last capture. This light event was in my mind, and the post-production was all about replicating it as much as in the previous image. In both cases, the atmospheric events that created the beautiful features were captured by the camera, and it's up to me to represent or find them in the post-production. I'll end with this last image of a valley we traveled to early on in my month-long stay. What struck me about this was the softness of the light in the sky and the valley, while the rocks essentially provided the only contrasting element. And this is one of the images that really helped me understand what's most valuable about the medium format equipment I was using and why it works so well for the Arctic light. It captures so much information that one can create the image they have in their mind because all of the information is there. Because of the influence that the atmosphere has on it, this Arctic light is so sensitive that I learned in editing that if I added any contrast, I'd lose its softness and the sense of the coldness of the air. And just to point out the differences, if I'd use smaller sensor equipment that will inherently compress the shadows or not capture the same level of information in the highlights, the softness of the light would not be apparent, would not reflect what I want, what I was seeing at the time, what remained in my mind, and the reason I was caused to make the image in the first place and bring it to the viewer. If I could replicate the time frame and took this image today, the last one we just saw in 50 years from now, that will be made in the year 2070. If we think about the changes that have occurred in photo equipment in just the last 20 years, I have no idea what many of you will be shooting with in 2070, but based upon history, one can assume it will be different than what you're shooting with today. That said, if I look at the similarities between this and the last image, it seems that while the equipment used to make each was very different, I'm struck by the similarities between the two as it pertains to my eye, yet the more recent Arctic image is materially better in all respects. While always still learning, and even if seemingly I'm still seeing things in the same way, over the last 50 years, I've learned different ways to approach or think about my photography. And I think improvements or advancements to the equipment have helped me in that evolution and helped me to create better images, or at least ones that I want to look at again. Thank you.
We're going to take questions and answers now, and we'll pull up the first question.
just since I'm new to this software, so the first question is, I assume you do your own printing. What printer do you use? And what are your preferred papers? Very good question. Yes, I do my own printing. And I've been using Epson printers for probably the last 20 years. And I've upgraded or replaced. I had a 10-year-old 9800 till last year, 2 years ago, and I replaced that with the P20000, which I have now. And I probably print more on Epson exhibition fiber paper more than any other paper, although I'm currently testing out some Hahnemühle and some Moab papers right now. Kenneth, I hope that answers your question.
Question and then a limited question. The question is, what tripod has Robert found to be light enough to carry strong and reliable and easy to work with in trying weather? Robert creates beautiful images. This has been such a treat to see so much of his work in one presentation. That's from Melissa.
Melissa, like that shot in the video is an RRS, and I couldn't tell you which model, but I tend to have, I think I have 3 RRSs, and all of my heads are Arca Swiss heads. That one was the D4, I think, and I've got Cube also works really well. And I use the Cube and the D4 heads in the Arctic. And again, unless I lost a cover and had the head freeze, they worked really well. But I'm finding that the RRS tripods are really stable and really light, and I do carry them around. Let's see. Does he have any metering tips? Good question for those high contrast yet dark light images. I tend to underexpose by a third to sometimes, not typically a full stop, but sometimes a full stop, or I'll use a graduated neutral density filter. I couldn't use, I tried filtering. I didn't really need to filter in the Arctic because you don't really have any contrast per se, but in other circumstances, I'll use a G&D if need be. What equipment do you use to make the 3 to 4 to 5 shot panoramas? Well, I guess it would depend upon, well, in terms of the bodies, like I've done it with the XT, I've done it with the X1D, the Hasselblad X1D, I've done it with the Arca Factum, and I do use gimbaled heads so that I can place the entrance pupil over the nodal point, the entrance pupil and the lens over the nodal point in the tripod and rotate. But if in a best case scenario for me, if I've got a camera that's got enough movements, one of the technical cameras with enough movements, I would much prefer a flat panorama, as I call them, as opposed to a rotated panorama.
About if you use frame averaging with the IQ4.
I haven't used it a lot. I'm sorry, that's wrong. I've used it a fair amount, or some, let's say, really trying to replicate, more in circumstances of trying to replicate what would be accomplished with a 6 or 10 stop down filter. And in some cases, I'm finding that it works well, like in, I think, one of the images that's shown in here in the river with the rocks. But in other cases, I find that with water, the longer one can do it, the better, because if it's shorter, I find that the water has what I would call horsetails, where we don't get a smoothness in the water that we'd like to see, or that we might get with a stop down filter. And let's see, are any benefit to using dual exposure for Arctic light? I never did use it. Again, when I was there, there wasn't much in the way of what I'll call strong enough light for that. And it wasn't dark enough either. What I found was even in the images of the northern lights, those are just 8-second exposures. And yet I found very little noise, and some of them were shot at 1200 ISO, but I found very little noise that I had to deal with in post-production. And again, the 5.6 and the f4 lens was fast enough. There's not a lot of trails in those star trails in those. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but. Is photography a full-time venture? If so, what did you do beforehand? How did you balance your career with your passion? Excellent question. I'm still working on the answer to that. I would say photography today is greater than 50% of what I am now working on. Since I can't say I've reached retirement in my former business life. I still do some, but I think about photography and work on it a lot. I was in the oil and gas business for 40 something years. And the balance between those was very hard. There were certainly times, as I mentioned, certainly let's say in the 80s, when I was working and raising a young family, and photography was again about taking pictures of those things. And it was not until I'd reached a point 20 years ago in that business world where I could sort of find a better balance and between the two of them. And so if I can organize it well enough, then I can think about devoting the time necessary to pursue the photography while at the same time trying to manage let's call it the business side. What I've not succeeded at doing at all, and I find it very difficult, is to structure the business part of the photography. If anybody has any solutions to that part, I would love to hear them, because there was a long time I actually gave my prints away. I didn't really like the idea of selling them. Today I put enough thought into them, and certainly enough financial resources and time and everything else. I don't want to disrespect my images, and which I felt like I was doing. And so now, if anybody wants one, then I sell them. But the business side of it is the part that I haven't necessarily accomplished at all. And there may be a part of me that doesn't necessarily want to, because I just enjoy it. Is there one place you haven't photographed that you would like to? Ooh. I know that there is, and I'm just not sure where it is. Because I still sort of, right now, I would say that 2020 for all of us has been so disruptive, and we feel like we're limited in what and where we can go and what we can do. And so I've really sort of got blinders on now in terms of where I feel like I can go. I will say that relative to the Arctic, I would go back to Svalbard. I would like to go earlier than I did when it's darker. And because I really would like to capture that light in even more subtle circumstances. But that said, it's not going to happen anytime soon. And fortunately, I live in a state that I can drive around in, and there's a lot of subject matter. And so I'm thinking about ideas here that I can get in my car and go, for some period of time and work on. But I think we're all ready to get out of 20 and hopefully 21 and be able to take our cameras and go and do things and capture the things we want to do. I do have a website, Sinclair-photo.com. Thank you for asking.
If they wanted to contact you regarding the sales of prints, where would they contact you? How would they contact you?
through that site. Yeah, through that site, and they'll be contacting me directly when they email through the site. What do you use to haul all your gear on shoots like Arctic? That's a really good question. I have the best pack that I have found. I've got Pelicans to fly with, and in some cases, if there's a way to transport, I mean, if we're using some sort of ground transportation vehicle, then I can keep them in the Pelicans. But if I'm carrying it on my back or even on the back of a snowmobile, and you raised a really good question in the Arctic, because my guide, Chico, who, by the way, outstanding, he lived in Svalbard for 9 years. He's now moved to Lofoten, northeastern Norway. He was a videographer, and credit him with the video that we got to see. But he would actually carry my backpack on his back on the snowmobile, because he was just in case I had an accident, he didn't want the cameras to get messed up. But I use a think tank pack, and I have found it to be absolutely the sturdiest to be able to put technical cameras in. It's deep enough to handle Arca Swiss RM3DI with a back on it and a lens on it, and the XT, which is smaller. And I'm able to put plenty in there. So I couldn't tell you which think tank pack it is off the top of my head, but it's the one that it's the pack I use.
Looking through your work and knowing that you have both color systems and black and white systems that you will have on a location, if you've brought both with you, can you walk us through your thought process on selecting one or the other? What is it that leads you toward the selection of a black and white or color image?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll say I'm still learning that, because I've now reverted back, as I said, to sort of that color film, black and white film decision, except it's with backs. And I've now just been shooting the acro for maybe less than 2 years now. And I tend to sort of, I mean, if I think about, I guess I'm naturally more about a black and white or monochrome imagery than color. So I guess my rule set is if it's the color that grabbed my attention first, I may not even see the structure in the image, because the colors can maybe overwhelm me. I mean, if I think about a sunset, the sunset, the colors in a sunset are what cause us to sort of really think about taking a picture of it. And we may try to capture that color and think less about the structure of the image overall. If it's not the color, it's going to be a black and white image. I'm going to shoot it with the achromatic, because if I'm wanting to take the picture and it's not about the color, that means I'm seeing something, let's say structurally, is the best way I can describe it. There's some structure in the objects that are causing me to say, this is what I want I want or need to capture. So I would probably shoot the achromatic first, unless the color's yelling at me.
Does anybody else have any more questions for Robert? Robert, thank you for a lovely presentation today, and thank you for everybody else for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate it. I thank everyone. I hope it was of value or helpful or interesting. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.